David makes his way to a redoubt in the mountains near the town of Lachish. The cave of Adullam still exists in Israel today. There, David's father and mother and brothers and their entire families join him, in fear of Shaul's vengeance. In addition, David is joined by 400 other men, those who inwardly feel themselves in turmoil, and others who themselves are being pursued, even by creditors. Episode 6, Shaul vs. David, Act 2.
Then says the said
David flees for his life, and he realizes that Shaul is unrelenting in his pursuit of him, for Shaul believes that he is pursuing a rebel against the kingdom. David knows he needs to run fast and far. But since hiding in the field and receiving the news of Shaul's continued enmity, his hatred, from Shaul's own son Jonathan, David is all alone and bereft of food and possessions, even the basic weaponry that an officer normally would carry. David has no arms bearer with him, nor even provisions to sustain him on the run. It is in this state, all alone and bereft of those worldly possessions, indeed of everything but the presence of the Almighty Himself, that David makes his way to the town of Nov, the ruins of which lie in present-day Israel. Nov was a town occupied by the priestly class, Cohanim, including the great Kohen, the Kohen HaGadol. There, in Nov, David makes his way to the Mishkan, the place in which the Ark of the Covenant is kept, between the wilderness and the building of the temple in Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount. In the interim, the Ark is not far away in Nov, and with it, as a matter of necessity, is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest of that generation, whose name is Achimelech ben Achituv. Achimelech receives David, but the high priest is amazed to see him alone and unaccompanied. David is, after all, the most renowned officer that King Shaul has in his army, and it is not befitting one of David's station to travel all by himself without a proper retinue of soldiers. David explains to Achimelech that he has left his retinue in a hidden place, far enough away to not know his whereabouts, for, he tells Achimelech, he is on a secret mission on the king's behalf. He asks first of all for bread for himself and his men, and Achimelech replies that all he has is the lechem apanim, the showbread from the past week in the Mishkan, and he asks David's counsel as to the permissibility of David and his men consuming that bread. David explains the concept of the lechem apanim, the showbread, in depth, and the high priest gives it to him. David also requests a sword from the high priest, but Achimelech replies that there is none to be had in Nov other than the sword of Goliath, the Plishtim champion, the dead giant. That sword ultimately failed its master, and so the sword, great and mighty as it is considered an ill-fated blade to any who wield it. But David replies to Achimelech that he does not fear to take the sword, for it was he, David, who vanquished the Plishtim giant Goliath, who wielded that mighty blade. It failed its master, Goliath, but it accorded victory to David as Goliath's opponent. And so the sword is a good sign for David more than anyone else. Finally, David asked to consult the Urim and the Tumim, the high priest's trusted means of consulting the Almighty, to which a king would be entitled or an emissary of the king. In David's case, Achimelech assumes that he is an emissary of Shaul, as David himself has told him, whereas in actuality, David himself is the secretly anointed king of Israel. This, indeed, is the impossible conundrum in which these two giants find themselves, Shaul and David. Two anointed kings, where only one can rule. There is another presence in the Mishkan, while David's interactions with Ahimelech, the high priest, occur. That presence is in fact Shaul's head advisor, a man named Doeg. Doeg watches and listens carefully as the high priest consults David, and David replies regarding the matter of the showbread. David marks Doeg's presence, and that presence is not unfamiliar to him. He knows who Doeg is. But desperate as he is, he does his best to ignore Doeg. Some background is necessary here. When David was introduced to Shaul, it was by none other than Doeg, who praised David highly to Shaul, and ultimately caused David to be picked as the lyre player, to ease the evil spirit that troubled Shaul's mind when the divine presence departed from him. Yet that first praise of David to Shaul, the Babylonian Talmud informs us, was praise by Doeg, deliberately calculated to arouse jealousy in Shaul, who by then had been informed by the prophet Shmuel that he was to lose his kingship as a result of his failures to follow the Almighty's instructions to the letter. Almost carefully, I know. It is to be presumed that Doeg and David knew one another from David's youth, and Doeg, who is also described as a young man, a nar in Hebrew, at the time he recommended David, was presumably jealous of David from their youth. He likely saw the greatness and modesty of the young David. For, the Babylonian Talmud relates elsewhere, Doeg was only righteous and pious outwardly, even as his ready wit allowed him to appear erudite in his Torah learning, while inwardly Doeg was a bad seed, a person of poor traits of character, on which he did not work. He did not work to reprove his bad qualities. His jealousy festered, and that jealousy would soon come to the fore once again in the form of an unmitigated tragedy of Doeg's own making. Ultimately, the tragedy will lead to Doeg's own death and that of many others. But more on that shortly in the episode. After consulting with the Urim and Thummim and transacting with Ahimelech, David determines, for that is indeed what he must have asked the Urim and Thummim, that he is no longer able to stay within Shaul's reach. This is highly significant, because only the king or an emissary of the king would be able to obtain an answer from the Urim and Thummim. Thus, when David asks the Urim and Thummim whether he should escape from Shaul by leaving the boundaries of Shaul's kingdom, he reveals two things to Ahimelech. First, that he has not been sent by Shaul, but that he is escaping from Shaul. And second, and most significantly indeed, that David himself must be the true king. For if it were not so, the Urim and Thummim would not have answered David. So now Ahimelech, and perhaps Doeg too, know the truth about David's secret identity. This secret would come to haunt the high priest all too soon. As a result of this kingly consultation of the Urim and Thummim, David resolves to leave the boundaries of Shaul's kingdom at that time, and he makes his way to the small Philistine kingdom of Gat, where Achish, also known as Avimelech, was the king, and there David sought refuge. But word quickly spread that David, the great champion of Israel and one of King Shaul's top officers, had arrived, and David feared greatly that he would be arrested, and worse, at the hands of Achish, and so he changed his manner of acting very markedly. He pretended to be insane, carving meticulous and nonsensical scratches on the king's gates, and pretending to drool markedly, as though unable to control his salivary function. Meanwhile, Achish's servants had alerted the king, telling him that the Hebrew David had come to his court, and warning that this man, who had defeated the great Plishti champion Goliath, had likely arrived to carry out Goliath's bargain that the winning party would subjugate the people of the losing side. Achish, the king of Gat, inspected the new visitor and scoffed at his servants. "This is the great David," he guffawed. He pointed out to them the insane behavior that was obvious to everyone. "Why," he told them, "you can see yourselves that this is nothing more than a madman. Do I need more madmen in my kingdom?" For it is told of Achish that there were indeed many madmen in his kingdom, and indeed members of his own family were mad. And so he ordered that David be driven away from the city of Gat. For those on whom the divine spirit does not rest, we might expect a bard to compose a song praising the brilliance of the ruse David used to escape Achish. We might expect David to proclaim his sagacity, his wisdom in tricking Achish and his men. But David takes no credit at all for the success of the ruse he employs. Instead, he fully recognizes the true source of his escape. David gives full credit for the success of his feigned madness to the Almighty alone. And so it was that on this occasion, too, David composes a psalm, Psalm 34, a psalm of praise to the Almighty who had saved him from the hands of King Achish, as follows. A psalm of David, when he disguised his true state of mind before Avimelech, who was Achish, king of Gat, whereupon he drove him away, and David went. "I shall bless the Almighty at all times. Let the praise of his mighty acts ever be in my mouth. Even now my soul glories in the Almighty. Let the humble and downtrodden hear the wonders he has wrought for me, and they shall rejoice. Extol the Almighty with me, and we shall exalt his name together." This poorest and most downtrodden of men cried out, and the Almighty heard. He saved him from all of his troubles. The angel of the Almighty encamps around those who are in awe of the Almighty, and he delivers them. Test this for yourselves, and you will see how good the Almighty is. Fortunate and forward striding is that man who takes refuge in him. Be in awe of the Almighty, O his holy ones, for there is no want or lack among those who are in awe of him. Young lions have found themselves in extreme want and have suffered hunger, but those who seek the Almighty shall never lack all forms of good. Come, O children, and give heed to me. I will teach you to be in awe of the Almighty. This psalm goes on, too long to quote in its entirety here, and is profound in each of its elements, each sentence of which, in many cases, is the foundation of entire fields of Torah study, such as the injunction in the next verse, for a person who seeks life to guard his tongue from evil. David makes his way to a redoubt in the mountains near the town of Lachish, the cave of Adullamim, which still exists in Israel today. There, David's father and mother and brothers and their entire families join him in fear of Shaul's vengeance. In addition, David is joined by 400 other men, those who inwardly feel themselves in turmoil and others who themselves are being pursued, even by creditors. These men join together with David and form essentially a force of outsiders and outcasts. Here, David remains aware of Shaul's burning wrath against him. Meanwhile, things are about to go from bad to worse under Shaul's rule. After meeting David in Nov, Shaul's young advisor, Doeg, wastes no time in informing his master Shaul of David's activities in Nov. But he does so in a way as to make Ahimelech appear to be deliberately aiding and abetting David in a rebellion against the king. He mentions David's consultation of the Urim and Thummim first, which consultation is a prerogative of the king alone or of his emissaries, meaning that in Doeg's account, Ahimelech realized immediately that David was fleeing from Shaul as a fugitive. Doeg mentions nothing of David's statements to Ahimelech that he was there in Nob, in the service of Shaul. That would have given an excuse to Abimelech for his answer to David. He also says nothing of the Urim and Thummim actually answering David, which would have meant that David would be revealed as the real king of Israel. As far as Shaul knows, as far as he's concerned, based on Doeg's tale, David is nothing more than an upstart rebel. Doeg also makes it seem as though he had come to Achimelech's home privately rather than in plain and open view in the Mishkan, as though the two were secretly plotting together in a secret place where they would be little visibility. Then, Doeg mentions that Achimelech gave David Goliath's sword as well as the showbread without giving any context to those gifts and making it seem as though this were aid in service of David's rebellion. This tale that Doeg tells is well calculated to rouse Shaul's suspicion and anger, and Shaul orders that Achimelech and his entire family be brought before him. When they arrive, Shaul confronts Achimelech with having received David, to which the high priest innocently responds that he did indeed receive David as the greatest of Shaul's servants. Shaul views this as a confession of guilt by Achimelech, and he faults the high priest for not informing him of David's whereabouts and for aiding him, thus committing high treason against the king by aiding the arch-rebel against the true king of Israel. Achimelech is taken aback, but Shaul's decision has been made. Shaul pronounces the death sentence against Achimelech and against his whole family. He orders the sentence to be carried out forthwith. But Shaul's servants balk at executing the high priest of the tabernacle and his family. So Shaul turns to Doeg. "It is due to your information that these priests have been sentenced to death," he tells Doeg. "So it is fitting that you, as a witness, shall be the one to lay hands upon them, as the ancient law requires of witnesses in capital cases, death penalty cases." And so Doeg takes Shaul's own sword and executes 85 priests of Nov on that day, including Achimelech, the high priest. It is for this act, among other acts of villainy, that caused the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos to declare that Doeg is one of a handful of arch-villains who does not merit a share in the world to come. And afterwards, Shaul orders the destruction of all of the town of Nov and the execution of all of its inhabitants. Lest we imagine that Shaul himself is an arch-villain, let three aspects of these appalling events be clear. First, Shaul believed he was protecting the people from the ravages of a rebellion against the divinely appointed king. While Shaul was incorrect in that belief, it was not strictly his fault. David has been anointed by Shmuel in secret. No one other than Shmuel, David himself, and perhaps Jonathan and a few others knows of the identity of David as the real king of Israel. Second, the sly instigation of Shaul's chief advisor Doeg weighs heavily in Shaul's decision, and it is Doeg who therefore bears the primary responsibility for the deeds in Nov that day, for it was he who incited them through his slanderous tongue. Finally, as we shall see, Shaul regretted and repented of this act in Nov for the rest of his life, and he is accounted by the sages as having repented fully during his lifetime and paid for his sin with his own life. The Torah does not portray its protagonists as people without blemish, nor does it gloss over their wrongdoing. On the contrary, the Torah, and indeed the prophets themselves, speak in an exaggerated language, even of what we would consider relatively small transgressions. But it holds the protagonists of the covenantal relationship between the Almighty and Israel to a very high standard of behavior. Thus, while we should be shocked by the events at Nov, it would be too easy to condemn Shaul. If we had been put in a similar position as he, the results very well might have been far more dire for the soul as well as for the body. Be that as it may, the results of that day were dire enough to chill the soul. Only one of Achimelech's sons survived the slaughter of his family, a young man named Evyatar. He ran away to inform David and David's redoubts of what had happened. He brings with him the Urim and Thummim, which he takes from his father, the Kohen Gadol, one of the means at the disposal of the king for consulting the Almighty about the right course of action to take. It was divine providence that had caused Abiatar to grab the Urim and Tumim as he escaped from the carnage that had wiped out his family. Rather than raging at Shaul for the slaughter of the Cohanim at Nov, David blames himself. He himself is at fault, he tells Abiatar, because he saw that Doeg was present in the Mishkan, and he had a strong suspicion that Doeg would tell Shaul of his presence there and make trouble. And yet he continues to speak with Achimelech. And so David tells Abiatar, I am in need of atonement for that. You, Abiatar, will stay here with me, he tells him. On the one hand, the fact that you are the remaining heir of the high priest will protect you because you occupy an important position in the Almighty's plan. That makes you, Abiatar, more important than I am, he tells him in true humbleness. But in Shaul's eyes, David tells him, I am the main prey to be hunted, not you. And so from that perspective, you, Abiatar, have protection because you are considered less important to pursue. Stay with me, David tells him, and with the Almighty's help, I will protect you. David turns his feelings of chagrin and sorrow at the murderous turn of events involving Doeg and the Cohanim of Nov once again in the form of a divinely inspired psalm directed towards the Almighty. Lam natseach maskil leDavid, to him who grants victory, an instruction by David. When Doeg the Edomite had come and told Shaul and said to him, David has come to the house of Achimelech. Why do you praise yourself with your evil, O strong one? The kindliness of the Almighty endures at all times. That which you have devised, your tongue thinks like a knife whetted too sharp that works deceit. You have loved evil more than good, falsehood instead of speaking righteousness. Selah. But since you loved all devouring words, the deceitful tongue, the Almighty will also break you forever. He will send you away and remove you far from every tent and uproot you from the land of life, Selah. The righteousness will see it and be afraid, but they will laugh at him. Behold the man who did not let the Almighty be the source of his strength. He trusted in the abundance of his wealth. Let him be strong, then by means of what he has plotted. But as for me, I am like the evergreen olive tree in the house of the Almighty. I trust in the mercy of the Almighty forever. I will yet give you thanks forever because you yourself have done it, and I will wait upon your name, as it is good to your devoted ones. In this psalm, even more beautiful in the original Hebrew language, David contrasts the falsehood and bloody machinations of Doeg with his own faith in the Almighty. While Doeg takes his own evil and bloodthirsty path against the will of the Almighty himself, David knows that the Almighty does kindness with him and those who truly trust in the Almighty. And he waits patiently and with great faith for the Almighty's mercy and kindness. Yet there is another one, who, while thoroughly righteous, is faulted by our sages for the disaster at Nov, and indeed for the subsequent tragic events that befell Shaul and his family. The sages fault none other than the noble and righteous Yonatan himself. In a discussion of the importance of giving bread to the poor, they explain that if Yonatan had paused and given David as little as 2 loaves of bread when Yonatan urged him to flee for his life, the episode where he shot the arrows and said to his young page, "Get the arrows, they are far," in a prearranged coded warning to David. If Yonatan had thought about that and given David 2 loaves of bread at that time, David would not have been compelled to stop to ask for food at Nov, and the entire episode of Doeg and the murder of the Cohanim of Nov would not have taken place, and neither would the subsequent death of Shaul and the Yonatan and his brothers either, as we shall see in future episodes. This may seem like a harsh judgment of the sages of the Talmud, but it is not. It is an expectation of those who work to perfect their characters that even small things count on the divine scale of justice. It is precisely because Yonatan's merit is so great that the sages and the Torah itself set the standard so high for him. For a lesser person than the noble Yonatan, the omission of providing bread might have been a vanishingly minor issue. But for Yonatan, whose stature is so great, it was decisive. In the next episode, Kings of Israel, we see the conflict between Shaul and David reach its apex as the two meet face to face twice for their dramatic final showdown. The greatness of soul that these two great men will leave the listener humbled and awed.